Welcome to this edition of Theological Journals, 3:54 p.m. on the 15th of July. The Lord be for us. Who can be against us? Who shall lay anything to the charge of God's elect? It is God who justifies. We turn now to the fundamentals in the faith. Chapter 2, the Mosaic Authorship of the Pentateuch, by Professor George Frederick Wright. During the last quarter of a century, an influential school of critics has deluged the world with articles and volumes attempting, again, this is the Mosaic Authorship of the Pentateuch, one of the most attacked positions in recent church history, attempting to prove that the Pentateuch did not originate during the time of Moses, and that most of the laws attributed to him did not come into existence until several centuries after his death, and many of them not until the time of Ezekiel. By these critics, the patriarchs are relegated to the realm of myth or dim legend, and the history of the Pentateuch generally is discredited. And answering these destructive contentions and defending the history of which they discredit can do no better than to give a brief summary to the arguments of Mr. Harold Weiner, a young Orthodox Jew, who is both a well-established barrister in London and scholar of the widest attainments. What he has written upon the subject during the last 10 years would fill 1,000 octavo pages, while our condensation must be limited to less than 20. In approaching the subject, it comes in place to consider the burden of proof. The Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch has, until recent times, been accepted without question by both Jews and Christians. Such acceptance coming down to us in an unbroken line from the earliest times of which we have any information gives it the support of what is called general consent, which, while perhaps not absolutely conclusive, compels those who would discredit it to produce incontrovertible opposing evidence. But the evidence which the critics produce in this case is wholly circumstantial, consisting of inferences derived from a literary analysis of the documents and from the application of a discredited evolutionary theory concerning the development of human institutions. And the next part of the argument will be failure of the argument from literary analysis. We turn to Dr. Michael Reeves and his work here, Theologians You Should Know, with his focus here on Justin Martyr. The main bulk of Justin's argument, though, is taken up with addressing what was, in its day, perhaps the most fundamental objection to Christianity. Just enlarge this a touch. In the 2nd century and centuries around it, antiquity was venerated and novelty despised. Thus, Rome was generally tolerant toward the monotheism of Judaism that otherwise jarred so awkwardly with its own pluralism and imperial cult, but was intolerant toward what it saw in Christianity as an upstart sect. Justin's response is to argue that Christianity is, in fact, the oldest of religions. Christ's birth was predicted by Jacob, Genesis 49:10, Isaiah 7:14, and Micah 5:2, among others. His death was predicted by many, Psalm 22. And since they understood such things, Believers such as Abraham were, in fact, Christians. The reason he argues why the Jews are not Christians is because they fail to understand their own scriptures, witness to the Father and Son, and the promise of Christ's coming. Worse, they even remove from their own scriptures verses that most offend them. An example he gives in Psalm 96:10, when he says they should read the Lord. He says, should read, the Lord has reigned from the tree, but from which the Jews had cut the words from the tree because of an obvious reference to the cross. Justin then goes on to argue that because Christianity is the oldest rather than latest religion, ancient and venerated philosophers stole their best ideas from it. In particular, he argues Plato plagiarized Moses in composing his philosophy. Moses, for instance, had created the tabernacle according to the heavenly pattern shown him on Mount Sinai. Plato had adapted this idea to suggest that all earthly things are copies of an ideal reality. Footnote 2, Justin Martyr, Apology number 41. No extant Hebrew manuscript has the words from the tree in Psalm 96:10, though it seems unlikely that Justin's argument came merely from a slip of memory. He repeats the claim in dialogue with Trypho. A number of other theologians from the first 5 centuries AD also believe that Psalm 96:10 should read, "The Lord reigned from a tree." Tertullian, Answer to the Jews, 5 books against Marcion. 2 manuscripts of the Psalms in Greek, the Septuagint, have the words. The equivalent words are also found in the Coptic Sahidic translation of the Psalms, probably made in the middle of the 3rd century AD. The words also appear in some copies of the Old Latin translation, the version used by the churches in the West before Jerome made the Latin Vulgate, used by Tertullian and Augustine. It seems most likely then that Justin was using a Greek version of the Psalms. In a physiological discussion concerning the Son of God in Timaeus of Plato, where he says he placed him crosswise in the universe, he borrowed in like manner from Moses. For in the writings of Moses, it is related how at the end of time, when the Israelites went out of Egypt and were in the wilderness, they fell in with poisonous beasts, both vipers and asps, and every kind of serpent which slew the people. And that Moses, by the inspiration and influence of God, took brass and made it into a figure of a cross, which things Plato reading, and not accurately understanding, and not apprehending that it was the figure of the cross, but taking it to be placing otherwise, he said that the power next to the first God was placed crosswise in the universe. And as was speaking of a third, he did this because he read, as we said, that which was spoken by Moses, that the Spirit of God moved over the waters. Where he gives the second place to the Logos, which is God, who is said was placed crosswise in the universe, and the third place to the Spirit, who is said to be born on the water. Guilty of plagiarism. Now for Princeton Theological Journal, 2007, with Shirley Baker's Contempt for the Classical Atonement. René Girard gives a viable answer to the question, why did the Passion of Jesus occur? Men killed Jesus because he revealed to them a God other than the retributive, vengeful God dictated by their tradition. It's Marcionism. Andre Dumas, in support of Geerhardus, says, "The cross is purely the result of the nastiness of men who do not support the new idea that Jesus brings from God, the new nonviolent conduct of men practiced in Jesus, the Christ of nonviolence. The non-sacrificial canon refuses a mercantile calculation in God. Christianity is repainting in new colors the solidarity with the oppressed poor and the hope of the coming historical age. The fact that Jesus, who rebelled against the strictures of institutional religion and oppressive forms of government, suffered a violent death at the hands of the authorities is no surprise. The Gospels predict such a death during Jesus' ministry. Thomas Aquinas supports this interpretation of Jesus' passion, labeling the act of putting Jesus to death a crime, calling Jesus' executioners murderers, and pointing to the leaders of the people as the agents responsible for his death. Abelard, too, denies that the suffering of the cross had any correspondence with violence on God's part or any mercantile relationship to God's forgiveness. Got some footnotes coming up here. For further study, see Geerhardus, I See Satan Falling Like Lightning, and Scapegoat. Andrew Dumas, footnote 44, some New Testament. I will discuss Paul's metaphors for the atonement and problems associated with them in another work, which is currently in progress. Aquinas clearly blames the rulers of Jerusalem for the death of Jesus Christ, yet at the same time he believes that they got away with their wickedness only because Christ submitted to their violence. The point I am making is that human agents, as efficient causes, bear the responsibility for Christ's violent death rather than God. The cross, therefore, should not be interpreted as a deflection of God's anger as punishment, as an exchange that transfers the guilt to an innocent person, or as some ledger amount which could be shifted about by divine finance so that God could afford grace. Out of love for humanity trapped in religious structures of violence, Jesus submitted to the religious and secular powers of that time as a prophetic protest against injustice, oppression, and systemic evil. He exposed them and simultaneously condemned the violence and offered forgiveness. According to Dorothy Soul, Jesus suffered the cross for us and because of us. She suggests that while Christ's suffering was not a divine imperative, it was not irrelevant. Christ suffered because human agents killed him. He suffered for us by standing with us in our suffering. Caputo agrees with this interpretation. He states that in many instances, the early church interpreted Jesus' death as a prophetic death, not a sacrificial one. That is, the death of a just man who took the hit for telling the truth, for speaking the prophetic word, for contradicting the world and interdicting its hardness of heart with his parabolic of the kingdom. It was the world that made Jesus pay, not God, for contradicting the world. We'll bring her to an end, thankfully, as we turn to Reformed Theological Journal and Geerhardus Vos, the interpretation of 1, 3, and 4 by Dr. Fesko. He's doing a tour of exegesis. Thomas Aquinas. In the Middle Ages, Thomas Aquinas, 1225 to 74, echoes Augustine's exegesis. He argues that Paul addresses the dual origin of the Son when he writes concerning his Son, where he reveals the eternal generation of the Son, something that was previously concealed. At his baptism, the Father therefore declared of his Son, "This is my beloved Son." The Son, argues Aquinas, is the Word and begotten wisdom of God. Christ, the power of God and wisdom of God, 1 Corinthians 1:24. But Aquinas explains that people have erred in three ways concerning God's Son. First, some have erroneously argued that Christ was the adopted Son of God. Photinus, died 376, taught that Christ derived his origin from Mary as a mere man. Because of his profound piety, achieved an exalted state. But Aquinas avers that if this happened, that Christ would not have testified that he had descended from heaven. Secondly, some have mistakenly claimed that Christ's sonship was in name only, such as Sabellius, 215. Aquinas has modalism in view here, namely that the Father came down and merely took the name of the Son. But if this were true, Jesus would not have said that his Father sent him. John 6:38. Arius, 250 to 336, wrongly taught that Jesus' sonship was created. Christ was the most perfect creature, but such a view conflicts with John 1:3, which says that everything was created by the Word. When Paul writes on the Son's natural origins in Romans 1:3, these three affirmation errors run into problems. The fact that Paul writes that Jesus was descended from David destroys Photinus' view, because Jesus was not adopted. This statement also contradicts Arius' opinion that he was created ex nihilo, according to both his divine and human natures. In short, Paul's statements create obstacles for heretical teaching because they affirm the full humanity of Christ. Paul turns away from Christ's origin, Romans 1:3, and pivots to address his power by three means: predestination, his dignity or power, and his sign or effect. Aquinas' first point originates from the Latin translations of the Scripture, which state that Christ was predestined, the Son of God in power. And thus God predetermined to ordain the incarnation of the eternal Son. Aquinas writes, just as a man's union with God through grace of adoption falls under predestination, so also the union with God in person through the grace of union falls under predestination. But Aquinas clarifies that when God predestined the incarnation, this does not mean that there was a time when the Son did not exist. Rather, Christ was predestinated, foreknown from eternity, to be revealed in time as the Son of God in power. In other words, God the Father predestined the fully divine eternal Son to be revealed both through the incarnation and the resurrection to power, to confirm his character as the Son. This point informs the second issue, namely, the Son's dignity or power. Thus, from the Son of God, he descends to the flesh, and from the flesh, by way of predestination, he ascends to the Son of God, in order to show that neither did the glory of the Godhead prevent the weakness of the flesh, nor did the weakness of the flesh diminish the majesty of the Godhead. Aquinas addresses the third point, which pertains to the sign or effect. In this case, the sign or the effect is that the Spirit of holiness wrought the resurrection. Through Christ, God would send the Spirit, John 15:26, and sanctify and justify sinners, 1 Corinthians 6:11. This does not mean that saints were never sanctified prior to Christ's resurrection, but rather from the time that Christ arose from the dead, the Father poured out a more copious dispensation of the Spirit, which began with Christ's resurrection from the dead. A manifestation of the Spirit in the resurrection of Christ reveals that Christ is the Son of God in power. Now we shift to Concordia Theological Journal and Should a Confessional Loyalty by Sean Murray. If it is asked whether the confessions need to be interpreted in a historically responsible way, the answer is yes, of course. It is certainly helpful to know what the historical context was for the Augsburg Confession, created as it was in the view of its predecessor documents, including the 404 Theses of John Eck, Schwabach and Torgau articles, and the succeeding papal confutation. However, this historical inquiry must never lead to a rejection of the doctrinal content. The crassest form of the historicist interpretation of the confessions is simply to argue that the Lutheran confessions were meaningful in the 16th century, but have ceased to be meaningful through the passage of time. They can only testify to a long, obsolete, or even dead confession of faith. Furthermore, the confessions themselves expected their content to obligate Lutheran posterity. The confessors did not produce these statements only for their own day, as though they had no significance for the future. The last paragraph of the Formula of Concord says this passionately and elegantly. Therefore, it is our intent to give witness before God and all of Christendom, among all those who are alive today and those who will come after us, that the explanation here set forth regarding all the controversial articles of faith which we have addressed and explained, and no other explanation, is our teaching, faith, and confession. In it we shall appear before the judgment throne of Jesus Christ, by God's grace, with fearless hearts, and thus give account of our faith. And we will neither secretly nor publicly speak or write anything contrary to it. Instead, on the strength of God's grace, we intend to abide by this confession. Thus, after careful consideration, and in the fear and invocation of God, we have subscribed our signatures to this document with our own hands. Formula of Concord, SD 1240. To reject the Lutheran confessions or part of its doctrinal content because they were not written by us or in our time is to fall into the historicistic error, or what I call the chauvinism of modernity. Would not a confession written 10 years ago be equally suspect because of the passing of time as a confession written nearly 5 centuries ago? Perhaps the obsolescence of which we are afraid is not so much the document, but in their own minds and hearts. The passing of time does not invalidate the truth, but rather the opposite. As we mature, our confessional heritage becomes more attractive. what we passed over as youth pastors and teachers in the church only becomes more precious with the passing of time, because we've seen the wonderful faithfulness of God's Word reflected in our real world experiences of preaching the content of the confessions. Hopefully, as we become history, our respect for it increases. And now for the Journal of Theological Studies, still talking about Peter's Philip confession of Christ's Messiahship. To you then, lo, I place in Zion a stone elect, head of the corner, precious, and he that believeth thereon shall not be ashamed. To you then the preciousness who believe, but to unbelievers, the stone that the builders rejected, this has become the head corner, stone of stumbling, and a rock of offense. They stumble and disobey the word. On this rock whence the ancient ecclesia was nourished, Philo said, now these things, prudence, temperance, and piety, are truly food of the soul capable of sucking, as the lawgiver says, honey from rock and oil from solid rock, indicates God's wisdom as the solid and undivided rock, which is nurturer and fosterer and nursing mother of them that aspire to immortal life. Elsewhere he calls this rock manna, the divine logos, eldest of things that are. St. Paul's proposition, now the rock was the Messiah, is rather an axiom accepted by philosopher and Pharisee at Alexandria and in Palestine. The difficulty is that as the text stands, one is thus compelled to identify the builder and the rock. On this rock I will build my church. Confronted by the veil of the Greek text, the reader must grope blindly after the interpretation of these sayings. We see the enigma dimly and darkly as in an ancient mirror. Already an emendation of the even intermediary has been suggested, which affects the prefatory formula and redeems this phrase, my church. But the unusual combination of particles is perhaps less impressive, and an emendation of the latter suspect may prove a more attractive road to the same conclusion. The order of words in the Origenian text, which is followed by modern editors, corresponds exactly to the English order. I will build my church. Oikodameso mu tein ecclesian. The order is almost as natural in Hellenistic Greek as it is in English. The genitive of the possessive pronoun precedes the word upon which it depends, being the equivalent of a possessive adjective. If this be true of the original Greek version of the saying, it might be suggested that the genitive mu was a corruption of the dative moi, but the pronoun could not be replaced by a noun. We turn to the Protestant Reformed Theological Journal of 2021. Classical Christian theism, defined above, finds vocal supporters also among Reformed Lutherans, Arminians, and Reformed Catholics. However, classical Christian theism has repeatedly been criticized and rejected, especially in the last decades, in contrast to this older view of a radically independent, simple, and purely actual God. Stands the newer approach of theistic mutualism, dubbed by some theistic personalism. In an effort to portray God as more relatable, theistic mutualists insist that God is involved and a genuine give and take with his creatures. Theistic mutualists may disagree among themselves on precisely how much control God has over the give and take process, but all are agreed that God is somehow involved in such an exchange. The method of theistic mutualism begins with the assumption that God is a person comparable to human persons, only without a number of our limitations. Although there are differences among those who hold these revisionist views of God, they all share similar concerns. There are both hard and soft versions of theistic mutualism. The harder sort regards God as a person who allows other beings to function as first causes or absolute originators of actions, events, or objects, and who himself stands as an onlooker within creation, susceptible to an increase in knowledge. Hard theistic mutualism also tends to regard God as needing the world in some respect, and so compelled to create and sustain it. For example, see John Geerhard, Theological Commonplaces on the Nature of God, Concordia, 2007. Carl Beckwith, Lutheran Dogmatics, the Holy Trinity. For example, Norm Geisler, Systematic Theology, God and Creation, Thomas Oden. And in this harder theistic mutualism that is espoused by open theists and process theists, soft theistic mutualism, by contrast, tends to hold that God does not create the world by dint of absolute necessity or need the world in any significant sense. Moreover, many soft theistic mutualists do not believe that God is intellectually open or in the process of development. Indeed, many who ascribe to the softer variety of mutualism have stood firmly against intellectual and volitional becoming in God. They maintain that God doesn't learn or depend on creation for his knowledge, and that his will is not changed by the action of creatures. Nevertheless, they do allow for a measure of ontological becoming and process in God, inasmuch as they, with the harder theistic mutualists, insist that God undergoes changes in relation, changing with his creatures. This ontological openness to change, whether enacted by God from within or creatures outside him, is the common denominator in all forms of theistic mutualism. Theistic mutualists may disagree among themselves on precisely how much process and development allow in God, but they all hold to a divine ontology that allows for God to acquire and shed actuality of becoming. Weird. Now for Themelios, the article on 1 Samuel 2 and Esther, the reversal motif. Esther 6 provides an amusing preview of the reversal that is to come. In John Levinson's proposed structure of the reversal motif in Esther, the royal procession of chapter 6 stands at the center of the chiasm, demonstrating that this event is the turning point of the narrative. If this is true, then the momentary reversal in Esther 6 creates an air of cruciality, suggesting that the entire narrative flows toward and from this ironic reversal. In the previous chapter, Haman was counting the glory of his wealth and possession, and yet even with all his wealth, Haman is not content. He laments to his wife, "Yet all this is worth nothing to me, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting in the gate." As an answer to this lament, Haman's wife and friends hatch a plot to acquire the king's permission to hang Mordecai in the morning. Haman presumptively constructs the gallows and afterwards sets out to receive the king's assent. While Haman and his evil cohort are concocting schemes and building gallows, the king is unable to sleep. The king's lack of sleep can be interpreted as an act of God, especially in light of the fact that his insomnia leads to a nocturnal reading of Mordecai's deeds which saved the king. The king asked if any distinction, Kadula, had been given to Mordecai as a reward, and found that had been nothing done for the man who saved his life. When morning comes, the king is told that Haman is waiting in court to seek an audience with him. Comically, the man whose execution Haman is seeking is the very man whom the king desires to honor. Upon his entrance, the king asks Haman what should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. 6:6. The phrase, "the man whom the king delights to honor," is repeated no less than 6 times in this short section, which furthers the ironic fact that this mysterious man is not whom Haman expects. His arrogant thoughts are recorded in verse 6. "Whom would the king to delight to honor more than me?" The prideful thinking leads Haman to recommend the most extravagant of parades. The man is to be adorned in royal robes that the king himself has worn, given a horse the king himself has ridden, and then crowned. If that were not enough, the noblest of the king's officials are to dress the man and lead him in a royal procession through the city. The suspenseful build-up climaxes in the king commanding Haman to do so to Mordecai the Jew, and ends with the humorous command, "Leave out nothing that you have mentioned." While Mordecai refused the garments offered to him in Esther 4:4, it is Haman, the enemy, who now must take off Mordecai's sackcloth and dress him in a royal robe. It is Haman who must put the crown on Mordecai's head, and Haman who must humiliatingly serve as Mordecai's herald. The clothing and crown are given to the humble Mordecai, who moments before was lying in ashes. In contrast, Haman, who longs to wear the crown, walks away in humiliation and a head covering. Rosh Vahapur was a symbol of shame. Footnote here. While his central focus on Esther 5 is debatable, Anthony Tomasino is certainly correct in saying the hinge of the chiasmus should possess true cruciality, being essential to the narrative or thematic development of the text. A chiasm necessarily focuses on the central thought or scene, and that scene should therefore be important. This self-made covering may be a subtle foreshadowing of the death shroud that will be placed on him before execution in Esther 7:8. In this way, Hannah's great reversal principle is powerfully illustrated as the poor, the helpless. Mordecai is crowned and exalted to a princely place, while the lofty Agagite who seeks to oppress him is humiliated and ashamed. This unexpected change of clothing hints at the reversal that will be completed in the final chapters. We'll bring this to a close, part 2, at 4:34 p.m. on July 15. If the Lord be for us, who could be against us?